Well, apparently, it's somehow been 8 months since our last Bleach Battle Analysis, which is absolutely crazy. When you have a variety of different series on the channel like we do here, you'd be surprised how easy it becomes to let certain video types fall by the wayside for too long at a time, not for any specific reason either, as the battle analysis videos are in fact some of my favourites to make. The last battle analysis we did looked at Ichigo vs Gin and their showdown during the endgame of the fake Karakura Town arc, where Gin's bankai was at last revealed. Today, I want to get back into the swing of things with a slightly shorter battle to help get the ball rolling again, or at least I'm anticipating it being shorter. The brutal, explosive slugfest between the head captain of the Gotei 13, Shigekuni Genryusai Yamamoto, and Aizen's secret weapon, the modified Rankar Wonderweiss Appears. And this is an awesome, frankly unique fight within the story of Bleach. At long last, the head captain is stepping into the fray when all other lines of defense have fallen. This battle is designed to be a statement from Kubo himself. To all who doubted or disbelieved in Yamamoto's mastery of every field of combat, take note. Yamamoto completely dismantles Wonderweiss using Hakuda alone, despite the Rankar being specifically designed to seal Yamamoto's Zanpakuto Ryujin Jaka away. Even though Wonderweiss succeeds in doing so, the head captain proves that he's more than just one of the strongest Zanpakuto in existence. It's violent, it's effective, and it paints a picture of power the likes of which we hadn't really seen, certainly not under these circumstances. But on the flip side, this is kind of a weird fight too. In many respects, I think this fight can feel a little unsatisfying on numerous fronts, depending on what you went into it expecting. In fact, it feels almost emblematic of some of the general issues that were facing the series at this point in the story. A desire to drag the Rankar arc, and by extension the rest of Bleach, out due to how popular this arc had become, meant that hotly anticipated characters were at last being put in a position where the stage seemed set for them to go all out, for them to finally have the chance to showcase their skills in full-on desperate warfare, with seemingly nothing to hold them back, only to proceed to, well, not do that for a variety of reasons. Both Yamamoto and Wonderweiss were characters that the readership was very excited to see in action after a lot of successful build-up, and truthfully I think this fight kind of underserves them both in the end, specifically Wonderweiss. However, this fight intrigues me too, as it feels like a lesson in we the readers being delivered something that we didn't know that we wanted at the time. And looking back on this fight today, it acts as a fantastic demonstration of exactly why Yamamoto deserved to be the captain commander all along. Anyway, this is going to be an interesting one, I think, and I'd love to hear your opinions on Yamamoto versus Wonderweiss down in the comments as well. What did you think of this fight? Would you have preferred to see Yamamoto go all out in a duel with Aizen instead? Did you have any theories regarding Wonderweiss's true nature, and how did you feel about his actual role in the narrative? We'll discuss all of that and more in today's video, so let's get started. Remember guys, as always, if you haven't yet hit subscribe and you enjoyed today's video and you want to stay up to date with the channel and everything else that I put out here, then make sure to consider hitting subscribe down below, as it really does help me out. And check out my other channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games. Consider hitting subscribe over there as well if you like what you see, if you're interested and you want to support me over there too. Again, it is all hugely appreciated. I am grateful for the support, so thank you all so very much. So I opened this video by saying that Yamamoto versus Wonderweiss would be a slightly shorter battle than what we're used to, and it is true. The fight spans really only 3 chapters in the manga, running from chapter 393 to chapter 396, but even then, the actual fight itself is really relegated to just chapter 394 and a tiny bit of 395. Because the truth of Yamamoto versus Wonderweiss is that it's really Yamamoto versus Wonderweiss and Aizen, as the battle both starts and finishes with Yamamoto challenging Aizen himself. Wonderweiss turns out to provide little more than a single chapter distraction for the head captain, though the modified Ranka does prove instrumental in Yamamoto's ultimate downfall as well. So while Yamamoto never really gets a true battle with Aizen, which is a bit of a shame, they do at least confront one another here, and it's cool that Yamamoto is essentially just given the floor for a few chapters. The entire Gote 13 plus the Vizard have all just been taken down by Aizen, and now it's up to Yamamoto to pick up the pieces. Of course, this fight is interesting too, in that it set the precedent for the main villain of an arc preparing countermeasures specifically for use against Yamamoto, because the head captain is just that powerful. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Yamamoto is consistently depicted in the manga as being the ultimate Shinigami. In terms of non-transcendent characters, there isn't a single Shinigami that can stand up to him in terms of raw power and battle prowess. And no, I'm not counting Ichibei in that as a normal Shinigami. Kubo makes it clear through several avenues, this fight being one of them, that Yamamoto is a complete master of every single combat art, and is essentially unparalleled until characters begin transcending, and even then, I still think he'd put up a hell of a fight at least to begin with. That's why even characters like Aizen, or should I say especially characters like Aizen, come prepared with these special measures for Yamamoto, and of course the same happens again in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, when Yhwach hatches an entire scheme to avoid facing Yamamoto at full strength. From the perspective of the reader, though, that's also partly where the inevitable disappointment comes in. This is a truly nerfed Yamamoto, and it's his final battle of the entire arc. Like I said, it matters less now that we know for sure he does get a chance to let loose later in the story, but certainly back in the day, many of us were hoping for more from the Captain Commander before he was brought down. I've always kind of thought this fight could potentially be improved by making it a little bit longer, by adding 2 additional chapters, where in each of those chapters Wonderweiss kind of keeps on coming back, but he's more wrecked and more ruined and less recognisable each and every time, and in each of those chapters Yamamoto is either forced to or chooses to use one of the individual combat arts each time. So this fight, for example, is clearly very focused around Hakuda, but imagine if there was another chapter where Yamamoto specifically uses this incredible litany of Kido spells to try and put Wonderweiss down for good, or he uses his skill in Shunpo to avoid what Wonderweiss is doing as Wonderweiss continues to grow even crazier and potentially more dangerous. But perhaps the greatest showcase of Yamamoto's strength is the fact he never really has a proper fight in the entire series until his battle with the fake Yhwach, and even then, it's hugely one-sided because he's simply too powerful for the majority of the cast. That's kind of the irony, I guess, is that when the setup is finally there for Yamamoto to have a proper battle against Roid, that setup is ultimately torn down immediately because Yamamoto uses bankai, and at that point he is suddenly way more powerful than Roid, and it goes out the window once again. But yeah, I mean, just look at his fights. Yamamoto breezes through Ion, one-shots not only the entire Trebestia, but also Driscoll, and then 3 other sternritter following that. That's what happens when you let him use Ryujinjaka, unfortunately, even if they do make for some truly spectacular pages. So yeah, things had to be different here to make this last longer than a few pages, but even then, Yamamoto completely steamrolls over Wonderweiss, albeit in a slightly different way. Okay, so who's involved in this fight? Of course there's Yamamoto, who we just discussed, but what about his peculiar opponent, Wonderweiss? For a while, speculation was absolutely rampant regarding what was going on with Wonderweiss and who he would eventually fight, but I don't think anyone saw a battle against Yamamoto on the cards. While unexpected, Wonderweiss's true nature is actually quite a clever idea, in my opinion at least. The idea that he was modified, somehow presumably by the Hogyoku at Aizen's behest, to be capable of countering and sealing Yamamoto's Ryujinjaka, effectively preventing the head captain from using his all-powerful Zanpakuto. I like the fact that an entire character had to be created essentially just to prevent Yamamoto from using a portion of his power, though it does feel almost uncharacteristically short-sighted on Aizen's part to think Yamamoto would be defeated so easily. There's no denying though that after so much build-up, Wonderweiss ends up feeling a bit hollow, no pun intended, and him being obliterated in a single chapter is definitely a weird outcome for the character. Because it's absolutely the case that there was a lot of anticipation and speculation surrounding this villain, this mysterious Arrancar for whom we actually witnessed his creation, someone who was said to have Espada-level Reiatsu but wasn't actually a member of the Espada, someone whose arrival at the Battle of the Fate Karakura Town was supposedly the signal to the top 3 Espada to get serious. Wonderweiss even breaks Harabel free of Hitsugaya's icy prison, and even crazier than that, instantly takes Ukitake out of the fight with a single strike, plunging his hand through the captain's back. Surely this character then is going to be a big deal in the future, and yeah, in some sense he was, just not in the way anyone expected. And of course, before Yamamoto, most characters end up looking like chumps. I definitely imagined him as an Espada Zero style character back in the day. And then there's Aizen, because he really is a part of this fight, there's no doubt about it. A moment ago, I mentioned that Aizen seemed short-sighted in how confident he was of Yamamoto's defeat simply by sealing Ryujin Jaka. Of course, one could say Aizen was, as always, a few steps ahead, and simply assumed Yamamoto would brutally smash Wonderweiss to pieces, thus forcing the head captain to throw himself in front of the raw power of Ryujin Jaka, as he does in the manga. But the way Aizen acts when Ryujin Jaka is sealed definitely looks like a man who thinks he's won. Plus, when Yamamoto does block the explosion later, Aizen notes that if he hadn't done so, the entirety of Karakura Town would have been destroyed. Would he really take that risk so knowingly? His entire plan would be gone, hence why he sarcastically thanks Yamamoto. Either way, this is kind of a break in the fighting for Aizen after he casually takes down every other fighter, and just before Deicide begins. Ichigo's around too, having just witnessed the collective defeat of everyone, but since he doesn't have much of a relationship with Yamamoto, he simply obeys the head captain's orders to stay out of the fight for the time being. That being said, I do love the way Ichigo leaps into the fray after seeing Yamamoto defeated, attempting to make the most of Yamamoto's valiant sacrifice by jumping Aizen during really his only moment of exposure after being swallowed up by Yamamoto's Kido spell. Anyway, with the combatants all accounted for, let's look at some brief context to see how we got to this fight in the first place. Now, we've already looked at the fight between Aizen and the allied forces of the Gotei 13 and the Vizard in a previous battle analysis, so I won't go into too much detail about it here. Suffice it to say though, Aizen succeeds in cutting down the final 4 fighters, Hitsugaya, Kyoraku, Soifon, and Shinji, after manipulating Hitsugaya into flying into a rage, causing the captains to drop their guard. It's a great moment, and it paves the way for the next stage of the war, with essentially the entire Gotei 13 on its knees, and their new Vizard allies on the ground beside them. It seems as though there's only one defender left standing, Yamamoto. Though, what about Unohana? The captain of the 4th Division's total disappearance from the story is very conspicuous indeed. She arrives alongside Ichigo and immediately gets to work on healing the wounded, including the bifurcated Hiyori, which of course makes sense, but I have to ask, at what point should she focus on fighting instead? I get that that's not really what Unohana does anymore, but there's definitely a bit of narrative dissonance when you remember that there is a perfectly unharmed Unohana walking around during the endgame of the Fate Karakura Town fight when the Gotei 13 are completely at the end of their rope. Presumably she watches Yamamoto's defeat, then watches Ichigo try to fight Aizen alone, then watches Isshin and the others arrive and lose before Aizen leaves for the real Karakura Town. I get that healing the wounded is her priority, and that once Aizen transcended or began to transcend, she probably realised that she was out of her depth, but she's also undeniably one of the Soul Society's strongest and most skilled fighters. Aside from Yamamoto himself, she's likely the most skilled fighter here. So for Unohana not to get involved at all does feel kind of weird, especially when it becomes clear the Gotei 13 are actually about to lose. Like I said, maybe she came to the conclusion that there wasn't much point in her getting involved, but that kind of defeats the purpose of the Gotei 13 themselves, in my opinion at least. Yamamoto himself even states later in this fight that their credo was to die to exterminate great evil. So where's Unohana when the going gets truly tough? What's the point in healing the wounded when they fail in their mission and the population of Karakura Town is annihilated anyway? Also, as an additional point, Yamamoto's plan, as we'll see in a moment, is to use Ennetsu Jigoku, perhaps his Shikai's ultimate ability, to annihilate both himself and Aizen, and he knowingly admits at the same time that yes, the rest of the Gotei 13 officers will be swept up in this, so it just seems like Unohana could have tried to fight at this point regardless. I can't help but feel like Aizen would have been legitimately concerned having to face down both Yamamoto and Unohana at the same time. But there's also something else we need to look at as well. Another scenario occurring almost entirely off-screen that leads into this fight. Kensei versus Wonderweiss. In chapter 377, almost 20 chapters prior to this fight even beginning, Kensei challenges Wonderweiss, who seriously injured Mashiro after her mask suddenly shattered during their brief scuffle earlier. After rescuing Mashiro, Kensei immediately activates his bankai, Tekken Tachikaze, and, well, we never see him again for the rest of the arc. I'm serious, Kensei doesn't even show up in the epilogue. We don't see Kensei now until chapter 479, at the very end of the Lost Agent arc, when it's revealed that he's now become a captain again. I'm trying to think, is this the first ever time a character has used their bankai, only for us to not find out what it does because their entire battle then takes place off-screen? It's a little different compared to situations like Komamura's first use of bankai back in the Soul Society arc, as their battle, his battle with Kenpachi, is actively interrupted. Komamura doesn't just disappear. Anyway, we can assume that Wonderweiss defeats Kensei at some point, or again, maybe he just runs away when Yamamoto activates Ryujin Jaka, leaving Kensei to look after Mashiro. But that takes us right into our next battle, Yamamoto versus Wonderweiss and Aizen. As chapter 393 opens, the defeated captains fall to the ground far below. Despite their serious injuries, they are too strong to fall unconscious, and so instead are forced to simply watch as Aizen emerges victorious. I've always thought it was kind of ridiculous that Kyoraku is taken out in a single slash, and the same kind of goes for Shinji too. It's a little more believable in the case of Hitsugaya and Soifon, they are both much younger and frankly much weaker, but for two of the elder captains to get one shot like that was a little disappointing. Ultimately, it just felt like we needed to move the story along, which I guess is fair enough. It's pretty brutal too that Hitsugaya lost both an arm and a leg from Aizen's one slash. However, as soon as the captains fall from the sky, an immense column of flame explodes from the cityscape. Seriously, just look at this thing. Thankfully, we have the Karakura skyline for size reference because this is absolutely insane. Yamamoto's power completely dwarfs everything, and this is essentially just the activation of his Shikai. As Aizen glances over his shoulder at the Inferno, in a really awesome and cinematic moment, Yamamoto himself emerges from the pillar of flame, a cold glare in his eyes. Of course, we've seen Yamamoto in action a few times throughout the fake Karakura Town battle. Each time has been very brief, a mere glimpse of his powers, but they've always been spectacular nonetheless. From unleashing Jokaku Enjo at the start of the battle in order to imprison Aizen, Gin and Tosen in a cage of fire, to incinerating the monstrous Ion with a single flash of flame, and following that up with an arc of divine fire that wiped the Trebestia out in one swing, every move Yamamoto has made so far has been calculated and hugely impactful. But now with the Gotei 13 defeated, the head captain is forced onto the battlefield for real at last. Turning to Yamamoto, Aizen tells the head captain that he's too late. He's the only captain left with any real fighting ability, again sorry Unohana, and if Yamamoto falls, the Gotei 13 is essentially finished. Smirking, Aizen muses that Yamamoto has missed his opportunity for victory. However, Yamamoto doesn't have time for Aizen's nonsense. Calling Aizen an upstart, Yamamoto asks him who he thinks he is, before wondering with a thoroughly unimpressed look on his ancient face if Aizen truly believes that he can cut him. I often think that Kubo's at his best when drawing these older, more rugged and heavily detailed characters, the likes of Yamamoto, Kenpachi and Yhwach for example, and this is no exception. These close-ups of Yamamoto always look absolutely astonishing. But, confident as ever, Aizen remarks that he's already cut Yamamoto, to which Yamamoto roars, swinging his blade in a wave of fire. However, Aizen is already behind the head captain. I've always wondered if this is meant to be Aizen just using Shunpo, or if we're supposed to think Yamamoto fell for an illusion, but either way the two of them twist on the spot, each fighter readying their weapon. Aizen appears to be faster and rams his Zanpakuto through Yamamoto's side. After all that bluster earlier, it appears that Yamamoto wasn't up to the task. Aizen has successfully landed the first hit, and a stream of blood erupts from Yamamoto's side, and yet something's wrong. Aizen has exposed himself and he's no longer fully in control. This is exactly what Yamamoto wanted him to do. With a toothy grin, Yamamoto lashes out, grabbing Aizen by the arm so tightly that his fingers dig into Aizen's flesh. As Yamamoto declares that Aizen is his, Aizen attempts to bluff his way out of the situation, asking Yamamoto if the arm he's truly holding belongs to Aizen at all. But of course Yamamoto isn't so easily fooled. As I said, this is exactly what he wanted. Aizen has given up the element of surprise and his illusions are useless. Yamamoto agrees that were his observations based only on what his eyes can see and what his flesh can feel, then yes, he might be deceived by Kyoka Suigetsu, but there is absolutely no mistaking the rare Ryoku of the Zanpakuto that stabbed him. There's no doubt about it. This is the real Kyoka Suigetsu, and the real Aizen is holding it. By offering Aizen an irresistible chance to get in close and inflict real damage on Yamamoto, the head captain calculated the risk and took it, sustaining an injury but obtaining invaluable insight. With a terrifying, shadowy look crossing his face, Yamamoto reveals that the time is now. This is his opportunity. Suddenly, towering pillars of flame explode throughout the fake Karakura town, completely swamping the entire battlefield as Yamamoto announces the activation of Ennetsu Jigoku, noting that every battle Aizen fought up until now was but a prelude to this moment. Ennetsu Jigoku is by far and away one of the most visually impressive abilities we've ever seen in Bleach, and this is just Yamamoto's Shikai. Aizen notes that this is what Yamamoto has been up to while the rest of his men were being cut down, to which Yamamoto states that he and Aizen will perish together in this burning hell. I always found Aizen's expression here to be very interesting. It almost seems like he's hurt to learn that Yamamoto would literally go to the lengths of killing himself just to be rid of him. But to be totally honest, this is an absolutely crazy moment. Yamamoto is attempting to destroy Aizen once and for all at the cost of his own life, ending the battle in a kamikaze blaze of glory, but there's even more. Aizen accurately points out that the surrounding officers will also be swallowed up by Ennetsu Jigoku and be killed as well, to which Yamamoto flatly states that they are all prepared for this moment. As we are treated to an amazing shot of the head captain, he declares that dying to eliminate great evil is the creed of the Gotei 13, as Ennetsu Jigoku prepares to activate. I have a few thoughts about this. Do we think the other captains would have all been killed by Ennetsu Jigoku or not? Yamamoto doesn't explicitly confirm that they are going to die after all, or that that was even the plan. He simply states they are prepared, before going on to espouse the belief of the Gotei 13 itself. I guess it's possible the other captains may have been able to escape having already known this was coming, but it does kind of seem like they are all going to accept their death in order to protect Karakura Town, which is of course extremely noble of them. And you have to wonder as well, if Yamamoto had pulled off this ability and destroyed Aizen as a result, and had wiped out the Gotei 13 to this degree, I mean, what would the Gotei 13 have looked like after this? For sure, the Vandenreich would have probably invaded almost immediately. I have to wonder about the Vizards, though. They are definitely not prepared for this, and had no idea what Yamamoto was planning, which seems a bit unfortunate for them, though perhaps Yamamoto expects them, as former members of the Gotei 13, to have already understood this to be their mission. In a very nice moment, however, Yamamoto orders Ichigo to flee. As someone who isn't a member of the Gotei 13, Yamamoto cannot allow him to die here. Now I wonder what would have happened next. I mean, how does Ennetsu Jigoku actually work? Would those pillars of flame have simply closed in around Yamamoto and Aizen before incinerating them both? Also, as I mentioned a few years ago in my video looking at the possible full battle between these two here in this moment, I do think Aizen would have been killed here. While he has fused with the Hogyoku, the fact is that he hasn't begun to transcend yet. The Hogyoku hasn't yet begun to understand his spirit, it hasn't begun to rewrite his spirit yet. Aizen is still having to be cautious and fight carefully. If he was already immortal, he would have just fought Yamamoto without Wonderweiss's help, as we see him growing careless later on. But here, Aizen is still very much vulnerable, but at the same time is running out for the Gotei 13. They just don't know it yet. But of course, we don't get to see what happens with Ennetsu Jigoku. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Wonderweiss appears behind the head captain with a sinister grin, albeit looking remarkably different from the last time we saw him. Yamamoto immediately attempts to swing his flaming sword at the creature, but to the head captain's shock, Wonderweiss simply catches the blade and the flames completely disappear, as if being pulled into Wonderweiss's very being. Before he can react, Wonderweiss punches Yamamoto in the face, sending the head captain crashing into the city below with an almighty blast. As Yamamoto wonders what's going on here, Aizen appears before him, the remnants of Ennetsu Jigoku dying out around them. Aizen openly admits that Ryujin Jaka is the ultimate Zanpakuto, and that if they fought one-on-one, Yamamoto would likely win. However, Aizen smugly notes that when all other powers are abandoned to strengthen one singular power, even the ultimate force can be challenged, revealing that Wonderweiss is the only modified Rankar in his entire army. As the slender, shadowy, alien-like form of Wonderweiss looms over Yamamoto, Aizen reveals that his resurrection is called Extinguir, and he was created for the sole purpose of containing Yamamoto's Ryujin Jaka, before bidding Yamamoto farewell as chapter 393 comes to an end. This is a really cool and effective cliffhanger in my opinion. As I mentioned earlier, I was never sure what to expect from Wonderweiss, and I don't think anyone really was, but this certainly wasn't it. And fittingly, Extinguir is absolutely the weirdest resurrection in the series, but that is clearly done by design. Wonderweiss looks completely unnatural, with a strange inflated body, a bulbous head, and numerous holes lining his elongated torso. It's as though he's been pulled and stretched outwards. It's definitely not the coolest design in the world, and won't be winning any awards in comparison to many of Kubo's other Resurrection designs, but it conveys what it needs to, that this is not normal at all. As chapter 394 begins, Aizen goes on to explain that Wonderweiss sacrificed everything to acquire this power. His speech, his intellect, his memory, and even his reason, leaving him as the strange, childlike entity that we've come to know. I was grateful to get an explanation for who and what Wonderweiss really was after so long, and I always liked the idea that maybe Wonderweiss chose to give all of this up himself for the sake of toppling Yamamoto, even though I don't think that's the case. Instead, it definitely seems like Aizen cruelly chose him as the vessel for this power and robbed him of everything he had by force. But now we enter the second stage of the fight, and Wonderweiss lunges for the head captain, who now can't use Ryujin Jaka at all, but it doesn't matter. With an earth-shattering force, Wonderweiss is suddenly launched backwards, careening across the cityscape with a gigantic hole in his side, his entire body cracked and broken. I'm not sure if it's meant to be a funny moment or not, but I always chuckle at Aizen just kind of turning back to look at Yamamoto after Wonderweiss has been sent flying. We're then treated to an awesome shot of the head captain, now without his captain's Hayori, which is funny considering he later berates Kyoraku Byakuya and Kenpachi for losing their Hayori too. Standing defiant with his fist outstretched, having punched Wonderweiss so hard it almost killed the Urankar immediately, Yamamoto asks Aizen if he really thought he could defeat him simply by containing Ryujin Jaka, and that Aizen is dizzyingly naive if so. In a truly badass moment, in a statement of intent, Yamamoto asks Aizen if he knows why he's been able to serve as the captain commander of the Gotei 13 for 1,000 years. And as Aizen seems to have no answer, well, it's remarkably simple. Yamamoto tells him with a dark, challenging expression on his face that it's just because no Shinigami stronger than him has appeared for 1,000 years. The shot of Aizen's eye indicates that he is unamused by Yamamoto's remark, but there's no time for that. I love that Yamamoto doesn't mess around, and instead just instantly appears in front of Aizen, readying a second massive punch and launching his fist upwards towards the villain like a rocket. I firmly believe that if this punch had connected, Aizen's head would have probably just popped like a balloon, and this is such a cool perspective shot as well. Aizen was obviously pretty confident Wonderweiss would return to protect him, but what if he hadn't? Was Yamamoto actually moving too fast for Aizen to react here, especially when he just appears right before him like that? Either way, it doesn't matter. A white blur comes between Yamamoto's fist and Aizen's face, and in an instant, Yamamoto reacts, swinging his arm outwards and sending Wonderweiss flying once again. As the smoke clears, Wonderweiss is at last visible, and the extent of the damage done to his body is revealed. And honestly, it's pretty shocking. That one punch from Yamamoto has completely fractured Wonderweiss's entire frame. Of course, he is missing a gigantic chunk from his side, but even more than that, cracks are running across his entire torso, down beyond his waist and up to his shoulders and neck. He looks like a splintered pane of glass or something. From these cracks, blood can even be seen spurting out of them, implying his body is barely being held together even now. I'll be honest, I'm not sure how he's still alive, looking at the severity of these injuries, and I'm even more surprised he's able to fly about the place still without just falling to pieces. I love the gruesome shot of his body regenerating itself in a mass of flesh. I remember originally thinking that was his guts spilling out when I first read this chapter back in the day. Now, Yamamoto himself is also injured too, though it is pretty hard to see. There's a wound on his wrist where he connected with Wonderweiss the second time, and blood is now dripping onto the rocks beneath him. Yamamoto admits that he didn't hold back with that first punch and that Wonderweiss is pretty tough, implying that Ikot's, Yamamoto's single punch technique, usually kills his enemies in one blow. At last, shrugging off the top half of his Shihakusho, revealing not only his immensely muscular form, but of course legions of battle scars underneath, Yamamoto himself prepares for the real fight, warning Wonderweiss that this might hurt a bit. As Wonderweiss's body fully heals, the Urankar instantly launches his arm forwards, driving his hand into the earth as Yamamoto leaps overhead. Yamamoto notes that Wonderweiss truly has been modified, as he didn't use any kind of preliminary moves before attacking, but as the head captain finds himself behind Wonderweiss, suddenly a third arm bursts out of Wonderweiss's strange inflated shoulders and rushes towards Yamamoto. Yamamoto dodges the arm before twisting round and grabbing it, tearing it off with nothing but his raw strength. It's interesting that here Wonderweiss's arm does seem to be made of flesh and blood, and it was the same earlier as well when there was blood coming out of the cracks in his body, because of course later on we'll discover that there is nothing inside him at all. Unless that's just his head, we'll have to have a look when we get there. But angered, Wonderweiss turns to Yamamoto and numerous spidery arms come erupting from his shoulders, pounding away at the head captain as he tries to defend himself. However, with his two original arms, Wonderweiss grapples Yamamoto and hoists his arms open, exposing the captain as the Urankar abomination looms over him with a sinister drawl. In a genuinely creepy move, Wonderweiss's shoulders then burst open in a shower of blood, revealing a tentacle-like writhing mass of arms within, horrifying even Yamamoto himself, his eyes open wide. I'll be honest, I don't know what this is all about. I don't know what Wonderweiss is really supposed to be all about, and maybe that's the point. I don't know if Kubo just tried to make Wonderweiss as creepy as possible to reinforce the fact that this form of his isn't natural, and if that's the case, well, it definitely works. I'm assuming Wonderweiss is maybe full of arms and hands because his power is all about containment and holding, and thus he's all about stabilizing things, but I'm not truly sure. Either way, with Yamamoto defenseless, Wonderweiss bombards the head captain with punches, hundreds upon hundreds of punches, raining them down upon Yamamoto himself in a violent outburst. I never really liked the anime's version of this scene. They give Wonderweiss this stupid sounding screeching noise when he attacks Yamamoto, and it really took away from the overall seriousness of the moment, in my opinion anyway. But Aizen watches from the ground as Wonderweiss seemingly batters Yamamoto without recourse, relentlessly brutalizing the head captain over and over, until suddenly a gruff voice rings out. As the dust clears, Wonderweiss can only look on in disbelief as Yamamoto peers down at him in one of the coldest panels Kubo has ever drawn. Beaten and bloodied, yes, but completely unfazed. As he asks Wonderweiss if he's finished or not, Yamamoto doesn't actually have the patience for an answer. Instead, he rips off Wonderweiss's main arms as well in one fell swoop, a curtain of blood splattering the sky. As Yamamoto discards the arms, he simply states that he's glad Wonderweiss no longer looks like a child, which is interesting in its own way, as it means he remembers Wonderweiss from when he first arrived on the battlefield, meaning he also recognizes Wonderweiss as being the one who took out Ukitake so savagely. But now he can beat Wonderweiss to death without any guilt. Interestingly though, this moment doesn't quite go as Yamamoto expected. Instead of the alien-like expressions that Wonderweiss has been making until now, instead, the Iranka is visibly terrified, and looks again almost childlike, and there is a real poignant sadness in Yamamoto's eyes. But the head captain does what he must. In a final double-page spread, Yamamoto utilizes his Hakuda technique Sokots, slamming both fists directly into Wonderweiss's chest. This is another impeccably drawn moment. I mean, it can't be easy making hand-to-hand combat look as imposing or interesting, or even as flashy as something like Ryujin Jaka, which is inherently more exciting to look at, but there is an undeniably massive weight to this page. Yamamoto himself looks almost godly as he delivers the final blow with conviction, ensuring that Wonderweiss dies almost immediately. We saw what one punch did to the creature earlier, well, this time it's pretty definitive. As we begin chapter 395, Yamamoto breaks right through Wonderweiss, shattering the Iranka to pieces like a vase. Wonderweiss silently screams, his mouth agape as a crack appears on his face, and eventually his entire body crumbles to pieces. It's definitely an undignified end for one of the arc's longest running mysteries, and as Yamamoto gazes down upon the ruin of Wonderweiss's body, including his completely hollow head which is now busted open, the head captain feels nothing but pity, saddened by the fact that Wonderweiss wasn't robbed of his emotions, meaning despite everything he had become, he could still feel fear in his final moments. Yamamoto turns his attention back to Aizen, calling him out for his cruelty. If you're going to rob him of everything else, why let him keep that? Aizen, of course, rebukes the head captain, stating that hollows have no purpose, and he gives them one. He gave Wonderweiss a purpose in being the seal of Ryujin Jaka. Yamamoto is the cruel one, therefore, for shattering that soul to pieces. In my opinion, this is a pretty black and white case. Aizen is obviously in the wrong here for taking Wonderweiss's soul and doing essentially whatever he wanted with it, turning the creature into a machine of war for no other reason than to hold back Yamamoto's fury, knowing full well that Wonderweiss would likely end up being completely pulverized by the head captain. And Yamamoto has had enough as well, as he lowers himself to the ground, telling Aizen that he won't get into a silly argument with him. Readying himself, Yamamoto clenches his fist, telling Aizen that it will all be over soon. Of course, Aizen has a backup plan. No, it's likely actually that this was his true scheme all along. Aizen reminds Yamamoto that Wonderweiss was created to seal away Ryujin Jaka's flames, and indeed we saw Ryujin Jaka grab Yamamoto's blade at the start of their fight and strip it of its fire, but of course another flame had already been unleashed by that point, the devastating explosive force of Ennetsu Jigoku, so where's that gone? Yamamoto realizes just in time that the power of Ennetsu Jigoku was also contained within Wonderweiss, and as he turns, he sees the remains of the Urankar's head beginning to swell. Yamamoto leaps onto Wonderweiss as the Urankar detonates, an enormous explosion illuminating the sky and silhouetting the cityscape as the power of Yamamoto's blast erupts forth. A tempestuous power rushing through the streets of Karakura as the sky itself is burned a bright orange. Honestly, I think it would have been a really cool little detail and highlighted the change in tone as the battle slips away from our heroes here in the endgame if the sky had remained a burnished red for a while after this, but alas. As the smoke clears, we see a heavily charred Yamamoto hunched over on the ground in the centre of a giant crater. Both of his arms completely blackened and half of his face burned too, though somehow his Shihakusho has remained almost completely intact. Aizen himself is impressed, or perhaps he's just being facetious, but he remarks that it's amazing that Yamamoto managed to contain the blast to such a degree with his own body, and that it's no wonder he's the Captain General. Aizen jeers that if Yamamoto hadn't held back the explosive blast, the power of Ryujin Jaka would have decimated the barrier around Karakura town and reduced the real town to ashes, killing everyone within. With a dark look on his face, Aizen thanks Yamamoto for saving the world, as of course now he's free to harvest its people for his own nefarious means. Cursing Aizen, Yamamoto collapses to the ground, no longer able to hold himself up. This is all an undeniably cool moment, and of course it is a truly astonishing display of not only Yamamoto's immeasurable strength and endurance, but also of his fortitude. His desire to protect the innocent, even at the cost of his own life, is unmatched. For a character who is often vilified, and rightly so in many cases, Yamamoto was absolutely at his most noble here during the fight. And while this is a cool moment, I also can't help but think it's a moment that doesn't really work if you end up thinking about it too hard. For starters, the flames of Ennetsu Jigoku appear to literally be stored in Wonderweiss's head. What would have happened if Yamamoto had fully smashed his head to pieces? Would Wonderweiss have just exploded and killed everyone around? And finally, considering Yamamoto was going to kill both himself and Aizen with this technique earlier, how is it now that the full force of the attack, unleashed at point-blank explosive range, not only doesn't kill Yamamoto, but also manages to knock him out? Presumably it's been dramatically weakened somehow, but you'd also think on the reverse of that it's actually been condensed, and Yamamoto would be experiencing even more of the brunt of the attack than he would have done originally. There's no doubt at the end of the day that it's a mostly contrived situation designed to take Yamamoto out of the fight. And that's fine. I much prefer this to there being a secret second brother who can also take the appearance of someone else, if you know what I mean. Anyway, with the Captain Commander soundly defeated, Aizen takes a moment to revel in his victory. Slowly making his way into the crater, Aizen stops beside Yamamoto and draws his sword, telling Yamamoto that unlike with the rest of the Gotei 13, he won't be sparing his life. Noting that Yamamoto is a living embodiment of the history of the Soul Society itself, Aizen will kill him with his own blade, when suddenly Yamamoto lashes out, grabbing Aizen's leg with his scorched hand. As Aizen looks on in shock, the head captain, barely conscious, his face blackened and bloodied, once again reiterates that Aizen is a naive upstart, before unleashing his final last-ditch attack, Hado 96, Ito Kaso, without an incantation. An enormous gleaming pillar of red energy in the shape of a katana's tip screams out of the ground, completely devouring Aizen in its wake. Admittedly, Ito Kaso doesn't look all that impressive next to the likes of Ennetsu Jigoku, but for a final attempt it is pretty badass. There are quite a few 90s level Hado that we haven't seen, to be honest, which is a bit of a shame, as they are always wondrous to behold. As chapter 395 comes to an end, the towering column of crimson light rises into the sky and Aizen leaps out of it, singed and bloodied, only for a shadow to cross his face as none other than Ichigo appears above him, his sword outstretched and his hollow mask active. This time, he won't miss his opportunity. I always adored this final panel, Aizen attempting to draw his Zanpakuto in time as Ichigo looms above him was always really awesome. But the fight isn't technically over yet. As chapter 396 opens, we get to see the activation of Ito Kaso from Aizen's perspective. He watches in shock as Yamamoto's blackened arm begins to crack and split open, a brilliant red light pulsating from within, like cracks of magma down a mountainside. As we see Yamamoto's final stare down, the Captain Commander glaring at Aizen from amidst the fiery glow, Aizen reveals Hado 96 is a forbidden sacrificial technique, and that the Shinigami must use their own body as a catalyst for its activation. Again, way back in the day, I definitely wondered if Yamamoto had straight up just died here, but was very pleased to see him back again when the arc was over, albeit now without an arm. But as Aizen is consumed by the Kido spell, we see him fleeing it from inside. There's a cool first-person perspective shot which is neat, as Aizen remarks to himself that he underestimated Yamamoto, and his willingness to sacrifice his own body. Let's discuss that ending very briefly, as it's always been a little controversial that Yamamoto's all-powerful Hado does seemingly so little damage to Aizen, and I agree that it's a shame. He's a little bloodied, his clothes are a bit wrecked, but ultimately that's about it. I definitely think that it would have been cool if the Hado seriously injured him, and perhaps secretly, that's when the Hogyoku begins to understand Aizen and begins to repair him. Ichigo could have even remarked that he was sure Aizen was more injured than he was when he first saw him emerge from the Kido Blast, but there you go. Alright guys, but that's it for today's video. That's it for the latest Bleach Battle Analysis looking at Yamamoto versus Wonderweiss and Aizen. As always, I really do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you took something of value away from this video as well today. What do you think of this fight? It is a bit of a strange one, I think. Wonderweiss, in my opinion, is kind of cool. The concept is cool, but the actual execution leaves a bit to be desired, I think, as Wonderweiss comes across as a little bit unsatisfying for a character who had so much build-up, and initially it was a little disappointing that this was Yamamoto's ultimate fight of the Urankar arc, but in retrospect it is very cool getting to see him let loose with just Hakuda, and to see him prove that he is more than just his extraordinarily powerful Zanpakuto, that even without it, he's probably still capable of defeating virtually everyone on that battlefield, and that is really cool. And of course, retroactively, we know that Yamamoto did get to reveal his bankai later on down the line, so from Yamamoto's perspective, I'm very happy with this fight, though it would have been really cool to see him let loose against Aizen in a proper battle as well, but there you go. It is kind of cool as well that this is the first instance of a villain using some kind of countermeasures to tackle Yamamoto because he's just so powerful, and of course we'd see that happen again in the future, only that time it would lead to a much more dire outcome for the head captain. Alright guys, that's it for the video. As always, I really do hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below about this particular fight, and again, I'm sorry it's been so long since the last Bleach Battle Analysis. Somehow time does just get away from you, but you know, it is what it is. As always, make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, and check out my other channel, Mr. Tomo Talks Games. Maybe give it a subscribe over there if you enjoy what you see there too. That would be an enormous help. And I want to end today's video, as we always do, by saying a huge thank you and giving a massive shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without who I simply wouldn't be able to keep doing this. Your support does mean the absolute world to me, and I really, really do appreciate it. Thank you all so very much for taking the time to watch this video. As always, I do hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.